Welcome to the Self Within podcast, where we will look to ancient traditions and modern insights to seek guidance, knowledge, and practical tools to help us reconnect with our true selves. Join me, your host, as we explore various topics from mindfulness and meditation to energy healing, astrology, and much more. We'll hear from experts and everyday individuals to explore the connections that exist between mind, body, and spirit, and how we can use them for personal growth. Lately, I've been really thinking about this one inevitable truth that we all have in common. So, regardless of our background, our identity, our age, at one point in time, we will die. And I know that this sounds heavy to talk about, but I also believe that there is this incredible wisdom that can be learned about life from death and the dying process. And so today, I'm really happy to have Debbie Charbonneau on as our guest, and she is a death doula, a shamanic practitioner, and a certified archetypal consultant. So, welcome, Debbie.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so curious to learn from you and your experience having been involved in the process, working with individuals, working with families as well as they are dealing with the process of dying and death and what that looks like. But my biggest question really is what can we learn about living, or how can we take advantage of the life that we have in front of us? We hear that quote or that phrase, life is too short. And it makes sense, but I think we tend to forget it because we get so wrapped up in the
Mhm.
day to day. We get wrapped up in our emotions and things we have going on with family and friends. So that's where I'm starting off right now.
There's so much that we could talk about because you're right. When we are active and somewhat healthy, if you will, we get so caught up with everything of day to day child rearing, jobs, paying the bills, all that stuff, and gallivanting around that there's so much that we can attend to get more in the present moment. So part of the teachings or the medicine of dying is about how to get in the moment, about looking at what is important to you, what is not important, who is important and not important. And when we are in a healthy place, if you will, in our active phase of our life,
Mhm.
it is about having a practice, whether that's mindfulness, meditation, spiritual, whichever practice you choose, in order to be able to remind yourself of your mortality so that you can engage with, in this moment, what is important to me. There are a variety of different ways that you could do that, but one of the ways I could say is looking at what your values are. How do you want to spend your time? With whom do you want to spend your time with? And doing what? You could also look at it as, how do I engage with my power, my personal power? How do I want to use my power with the time that I have on the planet? So whether that is 5 years you have, 30 or 1 year, it's still a good question to sit with. How do I want to use my power in the world? And for my own sake, for the collective's sake, it's the both and.
Mhm.
And part of my practice is with the wise woman tradition, which we always look at the both and, so that we can look at what is manifesting in our life. How do we engage with that? How do we get more whole, if you will, or what it would be whole making in this moment?
As you were talking, I was thinking about oftentimes, and I've been guilty of this myself, where you catch yourself in these moments where you think, oh, I will do that later. When the kids are older and out of the house, when I have more time, we create these timelines for ourselves. But what's funny about that is that we really don't know if we are even going to get to those timelines because death, as inevitable as it is, also so unpredictable. We could be healthy one day and then there could be an accident or something else happens. And so, as I've been thinking about that, it's also in a way forced me or maybe pushed me to make different decisions in my life when I really sat with that feeling of, am I really going to have to wait when I should be doing it now?
Part of my practice as a death doula is to help educate people that it's not just about dying and death.
Mm,
It's about the unexpected. You can have an injury, for example, and
mhm,
be in hospital for several months. You're expected to come back to your daily living. You're expected to come back to your active living, but you might be away for a while. So, how do you prepare for that time when you're away? Who's going to take care of the kids, the plants, the dog? Who's going to pay the bills? All these things. So, preparing for the unexpected sometimes helps people to get their foot in the door. If you look at some of the unexpected disasters that happen out there, and you
right.
hear people when they're sharing their story, and you hear them, I never thought this was going to happen to me. Anything can happen to me, anything.
Mm,
So it is a change of orientation, if you will, or alignment to look at, oh, if I do orient to anything can happen to me, it's not about triggering fear.
mhm,
It's about looking at if fear is activated, then you work through the fear. And you also, at the same time, prepare for the unexpected. What would happen if I needed to leave? If I wasn't home for a while? How do I want that to unfold? As best as can be, knowing full well that you cannot control everything. There is no way to know everything, to prepare for every single event. You can have a whole lot of things that you can do, knowing that there's going to be a need for going with the flow to adjust to whatever it is that the situation shows up for you and your family.
that's so true. In one of the books that I was reading, How We Live is How We Die, it was very much about how do we have these rituals and how can we already start to create this acceptance of the fact that there is death in all things around us.
Mhm.
And death isn't always the physical death of a body, as many of us think of
Mhm.
it. This is the one thing that was referenced in the book, which stands out to me so much, is that death can also be just the ending of things.
Yeah.
So just shifting the word from
Mhm.
death and dying to it's the end. If we think of going out with friends, after that event has happened, it is the end. Even if you brought the same group of people together and the setting was exactly the same, the interaction, the dialogue, it just wouldn't be 100% a match. And so we can think of our small interactions in our day as endings. The breakfast that I had is ended, and in a way, it's its own death.
You bring up a few things there for sure. Endings are, you can look at that as a simulation for death.
Mm,
There can be like an ending that there's a grief period, there's a fallow period, and then there's a beginning of something new. It's a natural cycle of life. So that can be little deaths.
yeah.
And the big D, as in the big death, the physical death of someone that you are close to. Look, let's face it, not all relationships are loving. Some of them are very loving, but some of them are difficult relationships. So, how do we end these things well for ourselves, for the other person, for whatever was between us, whether that is a friendship that ended just because the friendship is no longer viable or because the person has died? How do we end these things together? And part of that is getting comfortable with the uncomfortable so that we can navigate these emotions, navigate these events with ourselves and with each other, and doing it in such a way that it is, I'm going to say, nourishing. I know that's going to sound weird, but endings can be nourishing, can be healing, can be transformative. And so also, death can be that same thing.
Mm,
So, in your life, like you were talking earlier, when you are seeing a friend and you're saying goodbye after your tea together, your visit together, this could be the last time you see each other. So if you start looking at your day-to-day life as in this day will not come again, then how do I orient with my day, with the people I'm encountering that day? What do I need to complete with people? Is there anything that is unfinished business, if you will, or something went awry with a friend in a conversation? How do I bring that up in order to be able to complete with that so that is well between us? Which does not necessarily mean that we're still friendly. You see, we could be, but maybe not. So it is an orientation of how do I want to live my day to day? How am I going to use my energy, my power, my grace out in the world with the people I meet? There is also that preparation of having conversations and reading about it, talking about it. What do I want for my life? How would I see my life coming to an end? Like, what would I want to have happen then? If I was ill, who would I want around me?
Mm.
So for myself, thinking about these things and then sharing that with my close people. So that way they are not going to be surprised about, oh, you didn't want her, you wanted it him, or you wanted him versus her at your bedside. I didn't know that. And if you start that earlier,
Mm.
while you're still whole and healthy, if you will, then people have a chance to ask questions, talk to you about it. It's like, I don't really understand why you're saying this, or how come you're making that decisions. Let's bring in more understanding into our conversation, into our decisions, our actions, so that way the human piece,
Yeah.
right, is taken care of. You can prepare a lot of things ahead of time when it comes to your paperwork too, your will, your power of attorney. Like there's a variety of different things there. With all your personal information, we have such a large digital life now.
Mm-hmm.
Something needs to happen to that so that it makes it so much easier. It's a gift to your whoever is your executor to take care of those things after the death happens. So there's different pieces along the way, if you will, that can be done. The other thing is involving your loved ones. Like if you are pre-planning, or if you are ill and you're planning your vigil, your dying time, and your funeral, what do you want? But also, what is needed for your community to be able to say goodbye?
Mm.
Involving them in that process, whoever wishes to be part of that process. And how much can they be involved? Want how much they want to be involved, and how much can they be? So that way, you're trying to make it more whole for everyone. It's not about just one person. Do you see?
Mm.
Because the death reverberates
Right.
into the community.
The one thing you said too with completion, I think this could either be people that are unexpectedly dying or those that have been ill for a while and they know it's coming and they're just waiting. But that's where I think sometimes as humans, we can have these family grudges or we have things that we hold on to for so much of our life. And it occupies so much space physically,
Yeah.
mentally, emotionally. And I don't know if you find this with those that you work with who are ready to pass on or to transition, whether they are able to let go of some of those attachments or if some of them still hold on, because that's what I would think of when I imagine what completion could look like. Is there a time where I'm able to re-examine and forgive and let go and release things like that?
I would have to say that it depends on the person, because this is part of the medicine, if you will. That
Mm.
if you do it draw while you are pale and active in your life, to the best of your ability, it's like, oh, these words did not go well, or my conversation did not go well. I need to circle back to that. I need to phone that person and create a time for that
Mm.
so that we can end this better between us. Doing this while you are active throughout your life is a practice for
Mm.
endings, for dying. Because when people don't do that, let's just pretend someone is just going along and Once someone gets sick, their time, energy, problem solving will go towards what is this illness? What am I going to do about it? What decisions do I make? Like all that gets very busy there. And you don't necessarily have time and energy to have completion conversations with people. Some people do, but not necessarily. So you can't assume that you will have that then either. Some people will have some space, will go in the flow because they're already used to it,
Mm,
because they've been practicing it throughout their life. So it's easier for them to be, oh, look at that. This is showing up for me, and I need to embrace it or release it or whatever the case may be. But if someone does not have that practice, it is much more difficult, you could say. And there is a point when in the illness progress where you are starting to walk down the road of dying and death. So that may not be a possibility for that person anymore. But
yeah.
if someone has a practice, it's so much easier for them than someone who doesn't.
Well, and also because if you have a practice, it can feel like you can go into default mode. It's like, oh, I've been doing this for so long. I know the
Exactly.
steps. Whereas if you're just starting out, you're like, wait, what do I do? Where do I start? Who do I contact? Right. You're starting
People
fresh.
get overwhelmed. Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
I've seen people get very, very overwhelmed so that they cannot,
Right.
because think of it as getting all jammed up because they
Yeah.
can't process it
Right.
because your body is busy taking care of what's going on in the physical
Mhm.
body. So you don't have as much available to you to process emotions or process whatever's going on because it takes energy to process things.
Now,
Mhm.
when you're working with clients or with families, do you find any commonality among people in terms of things that come up for them as they're going through the process of dying or even just death?
You know, when you're 20, 30, 40, you make your bucket list and all that stuff, and your bucket list involves a lot of actions,
Yeah.
right? Action oriented things.
Right.
Well, when someone is dying, what is important to them is their people, their loved ones,
Mm,
spending time with them. So it's not about going somewhere else or doing something else. It's really about having that meaningful conversation that with their loved ones, spending however much time they can. And sometimes they don't even talk. You're just spending time together
mm,
so that you can be in each other's presence.
mm,
Now, for some people who are not accepting their end of life, their illness or their dying time or whatnot, or their family, their loved ones are not accepting that, then that can make it very challenging at that point as
mm.
to what to do or how to be with each other. It can be very challenging. Mhm.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
When it comes to that moment, you're totally right. You're really thinking, who am I going to be spending my final hours with? And you want that quality time versus the excitement, the action, the thrill, the movement, right?
In the book, Dr. Atul Gawande wrote The Immortal, and he speaks to many of his different healthcare colleagues. And there is one in there, which now the name escapes me, but the person is a researcher and researched what do we do as humans
Mm,
when we are facing an event that either may lead us to death or gets us close to death, or the threat of death is somewhat close, if you will. COVID, 9/11, those kinds of things, and how do we behave versus give it a few months where everything is somewhat peaceful, if you will, and how do we behave then? And it's just part of our human psyche to have this change happen. We start looking at what is really important to us and the value of our loved ones when we are in the face of a threat of some sort versus on a day-to-day regular day that sort of recedes a little bit.
mm.
It's not as dire to have meaningful conversation. We get caught up in the day-to-day living, for example. That is actually been studied and proven. But there are some practices that we could do, like how come the Buddhists meditate on death? There are some other cultures that deliberately think about death 5 times a day in order to get the psyche on board with realizing I'm a mortal being. Someday my life will end. So, what does it mean about right now?
Mm,
Because, really, in the grand scheme of things, what you have is right now.
right. And I started reading that book actually, Being Mortal. I think
Yeah.
it's great. It's so good. I mean, a lot of it does go into aging and what that looks like for populations that are aging and how they are also dealing with a lot of different things and living on their own and so forth. But I would definitely recommend it. I like what you're saying about the present moment because I think it's true. Again, guilty of this myself, but oftentimes caught in what's going to happen tomorrow, next month, next year,
Yeah.
what happened, 5 years ago, 5 days ago. Yeah.
There's nothing wrong about that. You see, it's having compassion because it is just part of life.
Mm,
And I guess part of it is really studying and embodying the life and death cycle, right? It happens all the
right.
time. If you watch the seasons, right? If you're in a area where you have the seasons, it's right there in front of you. So if you go along with those cycles, you are getting yourself ready for living and dying over and over again.
Mm. And the thing that comes up for me as you're saying that is the word attachment.
Hmm.
Because when I'm thinking of the seasons, I love the anticipation of the next season. And yes, there's some seasons I dread more than others, right? Like winter, not necessarily my favorite, but I'm accepting of it. But I'm not necessarily so attached to the season. I can very much accept the fluidity of the coming, the going. But I think attachment is also something that can be restrictive, especially when it comes to those things that we hold very dear, the things that we care very deeply about. I want to say the
Hmm.
people in our lives, the animals
Yeah.
in our lives. So I think there's a lot of those feelings that come from attachment. And maybe this is more of a Buddhist teaching, but how do we let go of those attachments so that we can allow ourselves to be a lot more free when it comes to these feelings of death or the reality of it.
Hmm. So if you are in that cycle of, oh, I've graduated, for example, of high school, how do I make that ending meaningful so that I am full and
Mm,
then I can move on, right? Oh, this job has ended. Oh, I have this new friendship. How do I celebrate that? Or how do I celebrate the things I need to celebrate, right? And how do I make meaning out of the things that have happened? Whatever those things are, whether it's happy making or sad making, it's the both and. And I would also say about detaching, exploring how come I'm so attached to whatever it might be, okay? So whether that is an item, a season, something that you can't touch, or a person or a pet, looking at the attachment. Is it an attachment that is, I'm going to say, quote unquote, normal? Like it's normal that I love my child, right? It's normal that I would grieve my child. People will say things to me like, oh, I don't want a funeral because I don't want people to be sad. People aren't sad because you have a funeral. People are sad because you've died. So providing a container within which we can be grieving together, having a community or communal event so that we can support each other through that is a much more whole making experience, much more healing experience than grieving all by yourself. There's a variety of different physical activities, for example, that you could do that supports your grieving process. It's not a switch, it's not like it's on or it's off.
mm,
It supports that journey of the grieving, right? Now there's a variety of different type of therapies, if you will, but there's also different actions that you can do on your own that you can do in community to support that so that we can attend to our attachments throughout our life so that when you get to be on your deathbed, you will have addressed the things that needed to be addressed, the words that need to be said. Like the people who you have in your life, do they know what what they mean to you? Have you shared with them how they impacted your life? How come you love them? How come you want them in your life or not? Right? So there's these tender conversations to have throughout your life that will start addressing and exploring these attachments so that, again, it's getting comfortable to be uncomfortable, because exploring those attachments is not necessarily comfortable,
Yeah.
but it can be very transformative though.
Right. I was going to say that. The reason we put them off, the reason we avoid
Mhm,
is just we don't want to get there. I think
mhm,
such a big focus I find on trying to live a happy life. And this word
mhm.
happy gets thrown around a lot. And don't get me wrong, I love happy and to feel joyful.
Yeah.
But when we do feel sadness, we hide. We don't want to show the vulnerability. Like, how quickly can we move on and distract ourselves? And
Mhm,
as a Reiki practitioner, I have found clients will come to see me for stress, a completely unrelated issue. And as we go through our session, as we start to talk about things, what comes up is, oh, right, there's been this grief from a
mhm,
parent dying or whoever that they haven't dealt with because it's how have they distracted themselves? How have they continued to move on through life? Because I realize it,
mhm,
we have other things going on that require our immediate attention, and we don't create that space. So it's this, how do we invite other people in to support us? And I don't know how good we are at doing
mhm.
that.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I would also say, like, sometimes people don't have a choice because of the circumstances in our life. They have to keep moving.
Yeah.
So it's like there's space for everything in there. But one of the things in regards to grieving, so if I said, okay, my father died for whatever reason or circumstances around the death, I didn't get a chance to grieve fully or whatnot for whatever reason. And then let's go down 5 years, someone else dies, and now I'm totally grieving this new dying death happening helps you to get access to the grief you felt presently for the current person, but also for any other grief you've had that you haven't totally completed with, or there's just another layer of it that shows up.
Mm,
So taking advantage of that time, those events when the grief shows up, it could be a song, it could be a movie, it could be a like a story you read. If that grief shows up, let it flow through, because in a wisdom tradition, we look at all of you is whole the way that you are. The healthy, if you want to think of it that way, the broken parts, if you want to think of it that way, all of that, you're whole already. So we embrace all of those things, if you will. Does that make sense?
yeah, it does. I want to go back to the other thing that you said earlier is
Mhm,
about celebrating the
mhm.
completion of a lot of these things. What came to mind is like people that have divorce parties, right? I
Oh,
mean,
yes.
you know,
Yeah.
it's kind of silly and it's funny when you think about it because, of course, you have a wedding party, but why not celebrate the experience, the learning? Yes, it didn't work out. Yes, there
Mhm,
was an ending, but there are those moments that we can create these containers, as you so rightly said, for ourselves to just acknowledge the ending has happened. And it can also go back to what we were just talking about with allowing ourselves to grieve, right? And so maybe my follow up question is also, what does grieving look like? What are the different stages of grieving?
Mhm. I would first say that the idea of having laughter and tears,
Mm,
whether that is a celebration or a funeral, all of it is welcome,
mm,
really. All of it has its place. And when it comes to grieving, now I'm not a grief therapist, so there's different types of grief, but there isn't the grief stages that have been associated with Dr. Kubler-Ross. She was actually speaking to dying people in their experience. It's not
mm,
about grief. So there is no stage in the sense that you are experiencing whatever it is you are experiencing. Now, the question is, are you able to get through the experience that you're having, the emotions or whatever the experience you're having in this moment? Do you have the support that you need? Is it complex? Is it complicated? Do you need extra support from a therapist to be able to get through the experience you're having?
mm.
Is there trauma involved? Then you need to involve the right professionals about that. So it's not a linear stage. It is, I would say, from the wise woman tradition, we would look at it as a spiral.
Mm.
You are going along in your life, you are experience grieving as a result of a death, for example, and then you have whatever experience, however much you do there about metabolizing that grief. And then you're moving along on your spiral, and then all of a sudden, oh, the grief is showing back up again. The thing is, you didn't backtrack, you didn't backslide. You're accessing a different layer of it or a different depth, you could think of it. So it's not a stage, they're just a movement, a
Mm.
spiral movement. It's always moving.
Oh, I like thinking of it that way. When I think of stages, it's like you have to finish one before you move on to the other. It's like a
Yeah.
stepping
And this
stone
is,
type feeling. And to be honest,
yeah.
the reality of life is that is never the case. Or maybe it can be. I don't want to say never because I think everyone is different
Mhm.
and experiences are different. But the spiral and the fluid movement makes sense.
I would also add that at some point, meaning comes into play.
Mm,
So whenever you have metabolized, I'm going to say enough of it, which sounds linear, but I don't mean it that way. It's more that when there's enough that has flown through or gone through you, very often people will end up having some kind of meaning show up or wanting to make meaning of whatever the experience has been. The thing is that you can't find meaning when the event is happening or right after, because there's a lot of metabolizing that needs to happen before you get to that meaning space. Mhm.
I'm just trying to think about everything we've talked about and kind of going back to where I started, which is what's the wisdom here? What can we learn about living a more, to use your word, whole and complete life? And I think a lot of it comes down to number one, having the awareness that we are mortal, acknowledging it in our day to day and not always having to wait for the finale, right? For that moment when we're ill or when something happens, when we're really having to go through the process. Starting rituals now, small rituals, things like celebrating through laughter, through
Mhm.
tear, through bringing people together in community, really starting to have some of these difficult conversations, as you were saying, allowing ourselves to feel the uncomfortableness, which I know how difficult that is. Is there anything that you would
I
add to that?
Yes, I would also say, like on a day-to-day basis, welcoming the day.
Mm,
It's like this day is never going to happen again. When you go to bed at night and consciously letting go of your day
yeah.
so that it's like, oh, it is complete. Okay, we're moving on. Whatever is not complete, let me note that so that I would can contend to it when I can. The other thing is when I say homemaking, I'm not talking about what some people talk about living my best life.
Mm,
I do not mean that. I mean what is whole right now for me. It could be that right now, for me, to create more wholeness in my life is to tend to maybe taking a walk because I need that in order to ground myself back again and to go back to work. It's being in your life right now, in this moment. One of the things my daughter admitted to me, I think she was 10 or 12, was every time she would leave or I would leave, she would also say, I love you. And sometimes it's like she's up the stairs and it's like, I love you,
Yeah.
before you go, kind of thing. And at some point, and because we've had a lot of deaths in our life,
Right.
one of the things she was saying, and so wise, I love you to be the last thing you'll hear from me. If ever you don't come back home, at least I know I've told you I love you and you've heard me.
Mm.
And that is very simple, okay? But it's so important because it's true. We don't know if we're going to see each other again. We assume we will, but if we don't, how can we end this moment together, which could be a very simple moment? It doesn't have to be a big celebration, right?
Right.
It doesn't have to be a big event, if you will. It can be, hey, we had a visit. We saw each other. We talked to each other on the phone. I want you to know that I really love you. I want you to be aware that you mean a lot to me.
Mm.
And if you engage in that in your life and start going to see each person in your life and let them know, you know what? Here's what I appreciate about you. Here's how you've impacted my life. It's a big deal. Like it's a transformative event for you and for that other person. Because in doing this, you're teaching yourself, but you're teaching the other person too at the same time. Because
Mm.
maybe they'll pick that up and say, you know what? I do need to say to that person that I love them. Or I really have this thing that I need to complete and it's not complete. And it's been nagging at me. It's how we can be with each other like this. Life is messy,
Mm.
right? It can be wondrous and messy.
Yeah. The polarity of it.
It's both and.
Yeah. And I'm already thinking about the people that I want to text message with my thoughts. It's
Yeah.
like pick up your phone and send that message to the person you haven't talked to in years. And
Right.
sometimes it feels weird to do that. You're like, oh, what are they going to think? I haven't messaged them in so long. But if you're saying
Mhm.
something, nice, or you're going to just say hello, I mean, even that is enough to start the conversation or just to let them know that you're thinking of them. And I think that can be enough.
Mhm.
So, what are some things that, if people are really wanting to get into this process of recognizing their own mortality, that people can start doing?
So there's a few different things. So I think it was last year I found this app that's called We Croak. And it actually reminds you 5 times a day that you're going to die. And it sends you a quote. And I can't remember now which culture that it comes from, but the idea is to remind you so that you can be in the moment.
Mm.
Like when the app is showing up, whatever it is you're doing, is it that important? What is the level of importance of what is going on right now? Are you frustrated about something? Or is the frustration a good use of your energy right now?
Right.
So that it gets you to realize where are you at this moment. And some other things, there's so many books out there. There's so many podcasts. I mean, so for one of the things that I really enjoyed, and it's two Canadian physicians that wrote this book. It's called Hope for the Best, Plan for the Rest.
Hmm.
But it would apply for Americans too, because they're talking about the healthcare system and how do we engage with the healthcare system. And it would apply for anyone, really. Their wisdom is really simple and it's actually down to earth. They have a podcast that's called The Waiting Room Revolution, really awesome to listen to. If you meditate, then you could pick up some meditations. There's a lot of Buddhist meditations, for example. And as you're doing all of this, you want to be able to have some support in your life to help you work through things so that if there is something that does show up for you and that you don't have the skills yet or the knowledge of how to navigate it, you want to have the support to do that. So that's something that I do in with the wise woman tradition with my clients. We go into these tender places and we engage with what's going on so that we can embrace, we can release. There are ways that people can use gentle practices to be able to work through what they're feeling, what they're experiencing. And we use breath in order to be able to tap into that and be able to release, for
Mm.
example. And it's quite transformative and it's a gentle way and it's something that anyone can do.
Awesome. I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Mhm.
And I know you've mentioned the wise woman tradition. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Um, if you look at the book called Healing Wise from Susan Weed, and it's pretty much the only book that that describes the wise woman tradition, and it's really well written. It's wonderful because the wise woman tradition is a mindset, a philosophy, a way of being, of living, and it's heart centered. So we go through the heart to be able to create change or create transformation or process whatever is going on. And we are oriented to truth. What is the truth about this? We are looking for clarity. It's a non judgmental tradition. So if someone is doing something that's not necessarily in the best of health for them, something they're eating or doing or whatnot, we don't judge them for that. We start looking at, oh, how come this is happening? What
Oh,
do you think is going on there?
mm,
So that we use wise questions in order to get to more truth about what's happening so that we can create more wholeness, more healthiness and whatnot.
okay. Interesting. I love that.
Mhm.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, I'm a firm believer that everyone has the answer to whatever question it is that they have out there, whatever it is that they're dealing with, because they know best their experiences and sensations that they might have in their body. And so uh, it is really about asking the right questions.
So, yeah, we work with what manifests, what is actually happening in your life. We work with that. And you could look at us as a guide, if you will, to navigate through, oh, like these bumps and bruises and all that stuff that is happening in whatever situation you find yourself or that is happening in your life. Mhm.
So when do families or people typically come to you?
So there's different points in people's lives. Sometimes they're in their 30s or 40s or 50s, if you will, and they just want to start pre-planning. What do I need to get organized? How do
Oh,
I organize it? All that stuff, right? It's more the pre-planning for the unexpected or for the dying time. Then there's people who will contact me when the illness has been diagnosed. It's like, oh, okay, I need to get stuff ready. What am I doing? What do I need to tend to? And then there's also people who contact me right towards the end, where it's almost an emergency, if you will.
mm.
It's like the death is almost at the door, and what do I do now? And then there's some of us who will get called after the death happens. It's like, oh, I want a home funeral. But that's something you need to pre-plan. And then there's people who call me after the death happened just simply because they want support in their grieving time.
Oh, okay.
So throughout the cycle,
Any final words from you as we bring things to a close?
oh my goodness, there's so much more we could talk about.
I know there is.
There's so much more. But I know that it can be challenging for some folks to talk about death or dying or aging or all that, all grief, loss. And yet at the same time, when we get in there and we are able to navigate this together, there can be such wondrous healing and transformation that can happen for people, for them personally, for their loved ones. And ritual is something that we didn't talk about, but it can be really important to create certain actions that are meaningful
Yeah,
Hmm.
I like the idea of ritual, and I think it's a very impactful one. And there's
Hmm.
no necessarily one size fits all. You make it your own. It's whatever resonates with you, whatever you need. And I think that goes back to a lot of what we talked about is having these meaningful moments for yourself, or if you need to bring other
Hmm.
people into the mix as well, to
Yeah.
acknowledge, to celebrate, to be in the moment.
People might be surprised as to the wonders that they find when they start engaging with their own dying and death, or as a general sort of exploration about death. They might find it surprising as to what they can glean out of it that really brings more meaning to their living.
Well, Debbie, thank you so much for this conversation, for sharing all of your insights. I know that I'm already leaving with a couple things that I know that I want to do, meditating on my
Hmm.
mortality for sure, and just seeing what comes up because I'm pretty curious. And then telling the people that are closest to me that I love them. And I feel like I want to extend that out a little bit more. A lot of people in my
Hmm.
phone that I don't talk to very often, but I like this idea of thinking about how they've impacted me. And I
Hmm.
like the saying, people come into your life for a season, a reason, or a lifetime. So there is
Yeah.
something there, even if it's a momentary passing, but
Hmm.
there's some level of inspiration or motivation that happened.
Yeah. It's beautiful.
Thank you for listening. If you're interested in becoming a client and working with me, visit me at nunatherapy.com or follow me on social media at Nuna Therapy for regular content and inspiration. Until next time.